If you look at the liner notes for the James Gang's album Thirds, specifically the credits for the opening track, Walk Away, it meticulously lists Joe Walsh's contribution. He is credited with guitar, vocals, and, I kid you not, Trainwreck.
Yeah, that is easily one of the most accurate, unfiltered credits in rock history.
It's so bizarre.
Right. The fascinating part is that it isn't a metaphor at all. It is a literal, physical description of what actually happened in the studio during the final seconds of that track.
Wow.
Because, after 3 minutes of this incredibly tight, locked-in groove, the song just abruptly stops and you are hit with this wall of absolute sonic destruction.
It legitimately sounds like the tape machine is just eating itself alive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to capture that specific sound, Joe Walsh took a fuzz pedal, cranked every single knob to the absolute maximum, and then took his guitar.
Which is a really nice guitar, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. A heavily modified, beautiful 1969 or maybe 1970 Gibson Les Paul Deluxe. He just threw it onto the hard studio floor and literally stomped on it.
That is insane.
He's just jumping up and down on this instrument to create this Pete Townsend-style cacophony of feedback, noise, and just sheer violence.
The contrast is jarring, honestly, because up until that exact second, Walk Away is this masterclass in funk rock control.
Yeah, completely.
It is so meticulous.
Yeah.
Then out of nowhere, total collapse. So we have to debate this. Was this just some wild moment of rock and roll excess, or was it an intentional sonic disintegration?
I definitely lean toward intentional.
Right, because it really feels like Walsh was physically, literally blowing up the limitations of the James Gang power trio format right before he quit the band.
I mean, when you map out the trajectory of his career, that moment of destruction doesn't feel like an accident at all. It plays like a highly calculated exit strategy. The James Gang was a 3-piece band, and Walsh was realizing that 3 pieces just weren't enough to hold the music he was hearing in his head.
You are listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. Today, we are taking you on a mission. We are analyzing the sources to understand how this one song, Walk Away, acts as the exact pivot point where late 60s blues rock grew up, scaled up, and gave birth to the massive 1970s arena rock sound.
And the only reason that Violent Trainwreck outro even works is because of the meticulously crafted tightness of the groove that precedes it.
Right, the contrast.
Exactly. You don't feel the impact of the crash unless the car is built perfectly in the first place.
Well said. Because this track really doesn't sound like the heavy, sludgy, bluesy vamping that defined so many late 60s power trios like Cream or Blue Cheer. It's entirely different.
It represents a complete philosophical shift toward the idea that less is more.
Mm-hmm.
The main riff of the song is built around the A-flat Mixolydian scale.
Okay, stop right there. For those of us who aren't huge music theory nerds, what does playing in Mixolydian actually do to the listener's brain?
Well, think of a standard major scale. Like if you play it on a piano, it sounds happy, resolved, complete.
Right.
The Mixolydian scale is almost identical, but it flattens the 7th note.
Okay, so one note changes.
Just one note. But that single flattened note changes the whole psychology of the riff. It creates this constant bluesy tension that never fully resolves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it constantly pushes you, the listener, forward, just waiting for a musical resolution that the riff simply refuses to give.
So you essentially have this inherent forward momentum built into the actual notes, almost like a motor running.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And Walsh amplifies that momentum by relying really heavily on syncopation and rhythmic pockets.
The groove.
Right. The genius isn't just in the notes he is playing, it's in the massive amount of empty space he leaves between the notes.
Which is hard for a guitar player to do.
It is. He plays these short, punctuated, stabbing guitar figures that act as both the rhythm and the main hook, leaving all this room for the bass and drums to breathe.
Which perfectly brings us to the rhythm section. Jim Fox on drums and Dale Peters on bass guitar. I mean, they are completely ignoring the standard rock band playbook here.
They really are. They're leaning heavily into funk and soul phrasing.
How so?
Well, in a typical late 60s power trio, the bass player would often just double the lead guitar part.
Right, to fill out the sound.
Exactly. If the guitarist plays a complex riff, the bass player plays the exact same riff an octave lower. It makes the band sound loud and thick, but it's rhythmically very static.
It's just a solid wall of sound with no dynamic movement.
Yeah, and Dale Peters just refuses to do that. His bass line emphasizes movement.
He's almost dancing around the riff?
He is. He's playing counter melodies and locking in tightly with Jim Fox's kick drum, giving the riff a deep, undeniable, funk-leaning backbeat. It literally forces you to move.
Listening to the rhythmic structure, it feels like a tightly coiled spring to me.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
There is just immense physical tension in how precise it is. And I know a lot of that clinical precision comes down to the producer, Bill Szymczyk.
Szymczyk is totally the unsung hero of this transition.
Yeah, tell us about his approach.
Well, in 1970 and 1971, most rock records still had a very loose, live-in-the-room feel. Microphones were placed far away to capture the ambient sound of the studio walls.
So it sounded like you were actually sitting in the room with the band while they jammed.
Exactly. But Szymczyk went the exact opposite route. He utilized extreme close mic techniques. He was placing the microphones right up against the drum heads and the amplifier speakers.
So he's isolating every single transient sound, making sure there's no bleed between the instruments.
Right. Every snare hit, every guitar pluck is perfectly defined, isolated, and punchy.
He essentially trapped this massive raw rock energy in a tiny pressurized box.
He did.
And because every instrument is pristine, it makes it perfect for FM radio. But it also creates this psychological pressure. You have all this Midwestern grit locked inside a clinical mix.
And that container simply cannot hold the pressure forever.
Exactly. The eventual train wreck release at the end isn't just a surprise. It's physically necessary.
And that pressurized feeling physically manifested in the actual studio gear they were using, too.
Well, the gear story here is fascinating.
It really is. Because Walsh was already outgrowing the power trio format, and you can hear it in the way he manipulated the equipment.
Right, because when the guitar kicks in on Walkaway, it sounds gigantic. You instantly picture Walsh standing in front of a massive wall of stadium amplifiers, moving enough air to blow your hair back.
Which is exactly what they used in their live shows, huge stacks of Marshall amplifiers.
Right.
But the studio reality is a complete paradox. To get that massive arena-ready crunch, Walsh didn't use big amps at all.
Wait, really?
Nope. He recorded that towering guitar riff using a tiny practice amplifier. He likely used a Fender Tweed Champ or a Blackface Champ.
We're talking about an amp the size of a shoebox, meant for practicing in a bedroom, not playing a stadium. How does a tiny amp sound so colossal on a record?
It comes down to the physics of how vacuum tubes distort when pushed to their absolute limits.
Okay, break that down for us.
If you turn a massive 100-watt amplifier all the way up in a studio, it is deafening. The sheer volume bounces off the walls, bleeds into the drum microphones, and turns the entire recording into a muddy, chaotic mess.
Right, the sheer volume ruins the isolation Szymczyk worked so hard to create.
Exactly, but a small 5-watt amp with an 8-inch speaker, you can turn every knob up to 10.
I see.
The vacuum tubes naturally overdrive, creating this incredibly rich, saturated, aggressive distortion. Because the amp is small, it isn't physically moving a massive wave of air.
So it's manageable.
Highly manageable. The producer can put a microphone right up to the speaker grill and capture all the aggression and crunch without masking the punchiness of the bass guitar and the drums. You get all the violence and none of the mud.
So he's using studio illusions to sound bigger than he actually is.
Exactly.
But he's also expanding the band's sound by treating the guitar as an orchestration tool. I mean, he starts layering overdubbed slide guitars all over this track.
Which is a radical departure from trio minimalism. A true power trio operates on the ethos of what 3 musicians can realistically play live on a stage.
Right, no backing tracks.
Yeah. But Walsh throws that rulebook out the window here. He starts layering these gliding, vocal-like slide guitar parts over his own rhythm playing.
It sounds so smooth.
He tunes the guitar to an open chord and uses a glass cylinder to glide seamlessly between pitches. He's enriching the harmonic texture, adding almost an R&B color to the song.
But let's look at the reality of this recording session for a second.
Okay.
If Walsh is overdubbing intricate slide guitars, layering multiple vocal harmonies and making all the complex sonic architecture decisions, while Dale Peters and Jim Fox basically just want to stay a hard-rocking live band, hasn't the trio already died in the studio before Walsh even stomps on his guitar?
Oh, absolutely. The trio format was functionally dead the moment Walsh decided he wanted to be a composer and arranger rather than just a riff player.
Yeah, they were on totally different pages.
The James Gang was a house divided. You have a visionary guitarist pushing for dense, complex production, anchored to a rhythm section that prided itself on raw, road-hardened street cred.
You can almost feel it in the track.
The friction is audible. The band sounds like they are pushing Walsh to his most aggressive limits one last time.
The crazy part is, that tension wasn't just buried in the overdubbed slide guitars or the studio techniques. It was hiding in plain sight in the lyrics.
The lyrics completely reframe the narrative of the song. On a superficial listen, Walk Away sounds like a standard rock song about a romantic relationship in a slow collapse. But the metaphor he uses is incredibly revealing.
The opening lines set the scene immediately. He says, "I got myself in the worst mess I've been, and I find myself starting to doubt you."
Yeah, the narrator recognizes his own complicity in the entanglement. There is a deep emotional stalemate happening. He wants to talk to resolve the friction, but the other party simply refuses to engage. What makes this so unique for rock music at the time is the absolute absence of typical rock and roll emotion.
Right, there's no passionate pleading.
None. There are no grand romantic gestures. There's no raging anger.
It's incredibly detached.
Very much so. The narrator is almost observing his own chaos from a third-party perspective. Walking Away isn't framed as an act of vengeance or heartbreak. It's a calm, calculated act of self-preservation and autonomy.
It honestly feels like the 1970s invention of quiet quitting.
That is a perfect analogy.
It's a brilliant irony. Joe Walsh is writing a deeply self-aware, emotionally detached exit interview from his own band, and he's singing it directly to the guys he's about to leave, all while maintaining this cool conversational tone.
Yeah.
He's essentially saying, we're in a mess, we can't communicate, so I'm taking my agency and I'm leaving. It's literally a professional resignation letter disguised as a breakup song.
And his vocal delivery reinforces that perfectly. It has a soul-leaning lilt to it, but it's wry, slightly sardonic, and totally devoid of panic.
Very cool and collected. Timing aligns with a massive cultural shift in America around 1971, doesn't it?
It really does.
The cultural hangover for the 1960s.
Exactly. The utopian idealism of the late 60s. The belief in open communication, communal harmony, that whole Woodstock ethos was rapidly fading.
The dream was over, so to speak.
The counterculture was fatigued. You have the ongoing Vietnam War, political unrest, and a rising tide of national skepticism following violent events like Altamont and Kent State.
Right.
The cultural mood was shifting heavily toward realism, resignation, and emotional detachment. Rock lyrics evolved to reflect that new reality. Detachment was no longer seen as apathy, it was becoming a necessary form of emotional survival.
And his exit strategy worked flawlessly. I mean, he walked away shortly after the Third's album was released.
Sure did.
He formed a new group, Barnstorm, launched a massive solo career, and eventually joined the Eagles. But what happens to this transitional song once Walsh actually achieves the arena rock heights he was aiming for?
Well, the difference between the song's initial commercial performance and its lasting cultural impact is vast. When the James Gang released Walk Away as a single in 1971, it only reached number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100.
Respectable, sure, but definitely not a blockbuster smash hit.
Not at all. Yet its cultural footprint became massive. Because it possessed that clinical tightness engineered by Bill Szymczyk, it sounded incredible on the radio.
Oh, absolutely.
It became an absolute cornerstone of album-oriented rock radio, or AOR. It evolved into a standard bearer for 1970s Americana.
You still hear it everywhere today. I mean, you, the listener, probably know it, even if you don't realize it. It featured prominently in the movie Licorice Pizza. TV shows like Supernatural drop it in whenever they need to instantly evoke that classic, gritty American road trip vibe.
Yeah, its sync placements are legendary, but the song's life as a live performance piece is even more fascinating.
Let's talk about that.
When Walsh left the James Gang, he took the song with him. But the most significant transformation occurred when he brought it into the Eagles in 1975.
Ah, the Eagles, the ultimate arena rock juggernaut.
Exactly. Now, the Eagles were primarily known for country rock hits like Take It Easy and Peaceful Easy Feeling.
Yeah.
They hired Walsh specifically to give them a harder rock and roll edge.
Right, they needed some grit.
But they completely re-engineered Walk Away for their live sets. If you contrast the raw James Gang original with the Eagles' evolution of the song, the shift is staggering.
How so?
The Eagles replaced that raw power trio grit with highly polished, harmonically dense, three-part lead guitar harmonies.
Wow. Let's break down how that changes the song mathematically and psychologically. What does adding a three-part harmony actually do to the music?
Well, instead of one guitar playing a riff with slightly unpredictable variations, you have three guitarists playing perfectly scripted notes simultaneously, the root note, the third, and the fifth.
So it's heavily structured.
It's an almost orchestral approach to rock music. There is zero room for error, zero room for improvisation, and zero empty space.
Which sounds musically triumphant, but it makes you wonder about the cost of that perfection. Think about the rough prototypes we build in our own lives, whether it's a creative project, a business idea, or even a relationship.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes the raw, imperfect version contains an authenticity that the highly polished final version just loses. By perfectly scripting every single note between three guitars, you remove all the friction and unpredictability.
You remove the danger.
Yes.
The eternal debate of rock music centers on refinement versus rawness. In the James Gang version, the struggle is audible. You are listening to a musician physically outgrowing his environment in real time.
Right, the tension is palpable.
But when the Eagles play it flawlessly in a stadium for 80,000 people, it's majestic, but the underlying threat is gone. The container has already been broken, so there is no pressure left to explode.
The train wreck already happened, so the tracks are perfectly safe.
Exactly. And that's why Walk Away remains the ultimate transitional artifact. It manages to occupy two spaces simultaneously.
How do you mean?
It is the very last great gasp of a gritty Midwestern power trio, and it serves as the precise blueprint for a solo guitar hero's future.
Ah, I see.
It builds the bridge from 1960s blues rock minimalism directly to the layered, massive production of 1970s arena rock.
It really is the sound of rock music growing up, scaling up, and getting sharper edges.
And, the song's ending gives us a fascinating lens to look through. We read the liner notes, guitar, vocals, and train wreck, and we naturally focus on the violence of it.
Naturally.
History remembers that fuzz pedal outro as a moment of pure chaos.
But what if destruction is actually a prerequisite for evolution?
That's the real takeaway here. To find your true voice, to push past the boundaries of your own potential, sometimes you have to be willing to plug in the fuzz pedal, throw your most prized possession on the floor, and loudly shatter the exact container that made you successful in the first place.
You can't step into a new era without making a little noise on your way out the door.
Precisely.
If you found this podcast interesting, please like and subscribe. Thank you for joining us today.